So there's this conference of parapsychologists, and it's the opening night, and the equivalent of our David Gill is giving the opening night welcome, and he's preparing to, walk people through some of the logistics, and he's very excited, and he's got the room full of participants, and it's a giant auditorium of parapsychologists, and the equivalent of David Gill says, this is so exciting, I can't tell you, we've got such an incredible schedule planned, and there's so much we have to present to you, and it's also great, but also there's so much experience. I know you come from all over the world. This is a unique gathering. We've never had this kind of expertise in parapsychology all in one place at one time, and I can't tell you, I myself am really excited about everything I'm going to learn from all the people who have come together here. I'm here as much to listen as to speak. And before we get started, I want to just see what kind of experience we do have out there among us. So I'm just curious, in the audience, how many of you, just to get a general sense of what we'll be looking at this weekend, how many of you have ever actually seen a ghost? Well, about 2/3 of the auditorium raises their hand, and it says, that's fantastic. Of course, I'm sure there's a lot of intimate personal experience out there, and we'll be wanting to hear from each and every one of you, even if it's like a breakout session or just a corridor conversation. And well, listen, before I let you go, of those who've seen a ghost, how many of you have ever actually made physical contact with the ectoplasm itself? How many of you have ever touched it first? Well, of the 2/3 that have raised their hand, maybe 50 or 60 hands are still in the air. So that's incredible. You are the kind of the elite, the creme de la creme. You've touched ghosts, and that's just extraordinary. And well, I can't wait to hear about that. And listen, just out of curiosity, of those of you who have touched ghosts, how many of you have ever actually made love to a ghost? One man in the center of the auditorium has speed release for me. Says, do you mean to say, sir, you have actually made love to a ghost? And the guy says, oh, I thought you said goat. That was a joke. Okay, so the second thing that I want to say is, it's a weird thing to be here, given this chance to close the whole thing, and I'm very conscious of the whole idea of authority right now. I'm your keynote speaker. You're exhausted. You won't even notice that I'm here right now. It'll be an afterthought. But something that's come up a bunch of times, and it seems interesting to me and important to me, is this idea of authority or credibility or the ability to consecrate or somehow canonize. And I've had a weird piece of fortune in my life that I happen to be the person in the place and the time who, for instance, my name is on those Library of America volumes. Mm-hmm. And I had my involvement in the bringing the exegesis to light. And at the same time, I have this testimony, which I'll go to a little bit before I'm done tonight, about what it was like at the very start when Paul Williams had first been handed this job of reviving the literary career, the literary fortunes of Philip K. And I'm conscious of this because it comes up a lot, and because I think about it anyway. And one of the reasons I do is because when we were talking about, why wasn't the exegesis material susceptible to a dogmatic, unified, authoritarian approach to revelation? Why isn't it a prospect for starting a kind of obnoxious cult or religion? Well, the reason is that it's so remorselessly self-undermining. It so destroys by instinct, by necessity, it destroys any ground on which you might assemble kind of authority or an absolute or a law or an injunction. Instead, it installs in the place the higher value of doubt, and interrogation. And so one of the things that I think about a lot is that I've been given, well, I have the last word this weekend. Maybe not quite, but I've been given the last word. And also, something I think about, it's in an essay that I wrote about Dick, is he doesn't get to talk back to me, and the things I say about him and the frameworks that I myself have had, like I said, the chance to push him into, just by reminiscing even in those essays I've written about, well, I read this book then, and I think this one's very important. So I want to do my best, even as I accept this honor, to also remind you that I'm just a fool like you guys, in love with this author who's changed me in ways I'm probably not even able to account for, because he's so fundamental, so oceanic in my experience of him, and that anything I say is just an opinion. I thought of this also when John, who made a film from Radio Free Algorithm, the first thing he wanted to say to me was, it's a good novel. You said it's not such a good novel, and it's a good novel. And I thought, oh my gosh, somehow it's important that I once said that. It was just an opinion. It's just an opinion. I've spent a lifetime trying to say what my favorite 5 or my favorite 10 Philip K. Dick books are. Well, a lot of you guys have spent your lifetimes or parts of your lifetimes doing that. My weird fate is that my 10 favorite are in the Library of America. So I have this sort of weird power. But it is just an opinion and a debate. And also, a lot of these things are subjective, in flux. On a given day, I feel differently. You may feel differently. They're open to debate. Also, there's happenstance involved. John said, Radio Free Algorithm is at least as good as Divine Invasion. Yeah, I think that's true. Sometimes I look at the fact that the Divine Invasion is in those glossy black volumes, and, for instance, Time Out of Joint isn't, and I think it's a disaster. It's certainly peculiar. It happens to do with the fact that the power of Valis and Transmigration kind of dragged Divine Invasion into print in the middle because of the concept of the trilogy, and I think of that happenstance, and I think all of this is accidental and strange. But I want to talk about this idea of authority and credibility and, the hegemony of Philip K. Dick studies that I sometimes feel like I'm the accidental spearhead of, or emblem of, because it's also come up in interesting ways, and I don't know if Ronnie is still with us. Hi. Hi. It was me that said, and it was a very incomplete thought, that despite how much Dick had always wanted to be recognized as a great literary author, that he might have, in fact, been ambivalent or done things to undermine that. And it's an incomplete thought, so you questioned it quite rightly, because it was still too much stuck in my head, and I hadn't gotten it enough out into the air.
Well, you used the term marginalized, yes. And I think that's, you're much younger than Phil was. Phil never thought of himself as marginalized or anything else. He just thought of himself as Philip K. Dick writing books, and of course he would have been thrilled to be recognized in the way that you have recognized.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I really would prefer to think that if he saw this kind of thing happening, he would be delighted, and that I wouldn't be his worst nightmare, for instance, for having done these things. But I have had the thought, and here's where I'm going to try to, even if this is also just an opinion, and even if it's wrong, I'm going to try to unpack it a little further, which is to say, there's something to me fundamentally transgressive in his approach. And I think that when he encountered authorities and sturdy hierarchical power systems of any kind, he tended to want to see them, he tended to want to follow them. And it is one thing, and a very natural thing, a very normal thing for any writer to wish to be taken very seriously. And I know that that was a genuine, absolutely real desire on his part. And I hope that he tasted it.
But he was afraid of authority, not,
Right.
Not
But I also
kind
think
of,
when you
afraid
look
of
at
authority.
certain moments in his life story, when, for instance, what he called the Marxist critics, when basically the literary theorists who were, in some ways, quite powerful at his contemporary moment, had begun to write about him. And apart, of course, from the button of, that they might be associated with the Soviet Union in some way, being pushed, I also think that when he sometimes saw glimmers of the chance that he might be hoisted to people's shoulders, or when he was invited to France, he also often found ways to throw a wrench into that, by instinct, that this transgressive nature ran continuously out of the work itself, out of the style of the work, the way the characters relate to their environments, the way they relate to societies, the way they relate to power structures. I also think this translated into his behaviors in some way, which is why I had that thought, which could still also be completely wrong, but matters to me, to think about. It's a way of questioning my own values and my own behaviors, which have always been, relentlessly, to say to everyone who listen, Philip K. Dick is as important a writer as you could possibly imagine. He's substantial, valid, literarily defensible, good citizen in the world of letters. And I think that that's worth doing, and I'll go on doing it. But I also have had this wry thought that it's quite a lot easier doing that with him not around than it might have been to do it. And that he had an instinct for not wanting someone else to tell his story, at the very least, which might have made some of these kinds of activities very, very different. We're here, in a way, in the vacuum that his absence makes, in an absence that makes certain things possible. And I think it's interesting to think about that, and worthwhile thinking about that. And it's a way of just, for one thing, just realizing that we live in another kind of Philip K. Dick novel, one where he died in the middle of what could have been a long life and an even longer career. In this alternate history, we got to start doing these activities of celebration and kind of gentrification, beginning with the Philip K. Dick Society newsletter and leading to all this stuff. But in another reality, he went on to write other things. He went on to tell us, God knows, he possibly went on to stop writing the Exegesis. Maybe to have not written it for 10 years and talk about that in retrospect. I mean, imagine what that might have been like for him to account for himself afterwards. I think about it. Okay, so what I want to do, I just have a couple of things I want to do on this list that you can't read. So that was transgression. This says the Marin integration, and then I didn't even finish writing it, the Orange County integration. I have one literary critical thought. This is like for the next Umberto Rossi, who's sitting out there. Because I'm not going to do it myself, I'm just going to throw the thought out there. But it's my, today, it feels like my little contribution to the kinds of theories that are generated around literary careers, and it's one that feels very important and interesting to me, and it emerged in my thinking this week. And so that's number 4, I'm going to do that, and then this thing says Confessions of a Crack Committee, which is I want to talk about the very beginning of what I see this as being a late example of, which is what happened, beginning in Paul Williams' garage. And then I want to just take some questions, because I, like the guy at the Paris Psychology Conference, I do think that your testimonies are, you guys couldn't talk back to us enough, and there was never enough time for question and answer during this whole weekend, so I want to grab one last chance for some of that. And if Philip K. Dick were writing that joke about the Conference of Parapsychologists, he would take it one step further, and it would turn out that the goat guy was the one who really knew everything. He wasn't wrong, but actually, in some strange way, having been intimate with a goat contained the essence of all human knowledge, and ghost people were totally out of line. The Marin integration and the Orange County integration. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, there's a fairly conventionally well-received idea in the development of Dick's art. It's one that certainly makes sense to me. I've already referenced it out loud on stage here once this weekend. And that is that in the 50s he was kind of divided. He wrote the realist novels and he wrote what he thought of as pulp science fiction novels. Some of them very good, very vibrant, full of energy and ideas, but then at a certain moment in Marin, when he goes to that writing shack and begins
the hovel, he calls it the hovel.
He goes in there and he says, fuck it, I'm going to take the mainstream ambitions, the aspiration to write in a humanistically sensitive and literarily deep way about human experience, and I'm going to integrate it with the science fiction because I can't publish those things. And that's when you get The Man in the High Castle and Martian Time Slip, most specifically, very quickly. And that his art raises to another level because of this integration of two divided parts of his writing life. And I think he himself agrees with this or offers this image. I know I'm very conscious of Kim Stanley Robinson writing about it in the very influential early monograph of Robinson's. And it makes sense to me. It feels like what happened and why the work expanded and deepened and why we have the writer who rewards the extent of investment. I don't think that there's anything wrong. There's actually an inordinate amount right with the best of the 50s novels, Eye in the Sky and Time Out of Joint, which itself is a kind of early integration. And then to a lesser extent, a couple of the others. But it's with Man in the High Castle and those novels of 63 and 64 that suddenly he's this great novelist. He becomes a great novelist at that moment. And so I believe in the Marin integration, okay? And you guys may be familiar with it, or this may be the first time you're hearing it, but I feel like you probably recognize what I mean. Now, so what's the Orange County integration? This is my idea. This is the one I'm throwing out to you guys tonight. I was thinking about the greatness of Scanner Darkly and Valis, which I think are, on almost any given day, I've talked about my 5 favorite or my 10 favorite, they to me are at the towering summit. They're almost never off my list of the greatest of his novels. And some days I think one or the other of those, or both of those are just about in the top positions. Certainly there are a lot of readers for whom, if they were saying, so what's all this about Philip K. Dick, the book I give them would be Scanner, to just absolutely persuade them in one massive, head exploding collision. What is it about those books, and what makes them different from the ones that preceded them? What is it on the terms of the novel that he's doing differently? And I think he knows he's doing differently. In fact, there's a reference in the Exegesis where he's writing Valis and he remarks suddenly, he says, I've just written in a way that's like a great contemporary writer. And I don't remember who he's reminding himself of, but he knows that he's kind of changed his voice and done something new. So what, if the Marin integration is that he's taken the mainstream novels and collapsed them into his science fiction aspirations, what happened? Well, I think it is, in a weird way, the next part of his life, the next part of his world that was still excluded from his writing was this life as a raconteur, this life as a late-night bull session man, this life as a crap artist of conversation, of persuasion, of dialectic with crazy friends, and also in his letters, the enormous, explosive correspondences. Well, I think what he did basically was fold another thing into his art. I think at that moment he suddenly took this world that came from his life, all the things he did with language, with voice, you too. And he crowded them in there. And that's what you get in Scanner Darkly and Valis most specifically, and in with such an extraordinarily rewarding result, is you get the guy who, we were reminiscing about, and the people who've been with him were trying to bring to life for us. The guy who wanted to buttonhole you and play with your mind and challenge, dare you to contradict him and spin out late-night theories about the universe. And he realized that can go in the novels too. And that's the thing about the novel. The novel is a part of inclusion. It grows, traditionally and historically, by figuring out you can grab onto more of life. And so I think there are two moments where Dick realizes that his life as a novelist can open its arms and grab more, and pull more inside. There's the Marin integration, and then there's the Orange County integration. When, beginning in a sense, when he, goes down there and the young writers, the Tim Powers and Blaylock and the other fans and writers begin to hang out with him in those, his life becomes dominated by his weird presences like the unreliable narrator, elder statesman, this guy who kind of dominates rooms but is ridiculous and problematic, and he starts to write about it and put it inside. The other thing that this reminds me of is that, we hear a lot of names, a lot of comparisons. When people compare him to, for instance, Pynchon, they're thinking very much in terms of the content, the subject matter, his relationship to rockets and Germany and drugs. But I also think there's a comparison that has gone completely unremarked, and that is that one of the most important and recognized as important, post-war American careers has a remarkable similarity to certain of Dick's novels, and that is Philip Roth. I think that very few people have realized how much Roth's fragmentation of narrative viewpoint and his splitting of himself into Roth and Zuckerman is absolutely of a part with Scanner Darkly and Valis specifically. Counterlife, which is one of the great post-war American novels, exemplifies this. It's Philip Roth's Valis, essentially. It's unstable narration created by the writer claiming to be himself, but also separating himself into a fictional character who he regards skeptically and enters into an almost combative kind of rivalrous dialogue within the space of the novel. This is the comparison that I throw at you just again. Somebody do something with it. Okay, that's the end of the lit crit. So, last subject before I just take some questions until you tell me to go away, is called Confessions of a Crap Committee. So I'm very moved. It seems very important to me in a way that we are all here together, and that it's in the Bay Area, and that it is, I don't know, it feels to me like a full circle moment. I'm looking right now at John Fairchild, with whom I literally, when I was a daft and probably really annoying, he can tell me now if I was, 22-year-old, clinging to Paul Williams' sleeve, asking him to give me important things to do. Well, what he had for me to do, and he was making John and a number of others do it too, was stuff newsletters into envelopes and put them in order according to zip code so that they could be sent out by bulk mail. So, in the spirit of the conference on parapsychology, I want to ask you, first of all, is there anyone besides John who was actually an envelope stuffer for the Philip K. Dick Society newsletter? I know we saw a couple other people earlier in the weekend. Here we are. Thank you.
I wrote something for the newsletter.
You wrote something for who else wrote something for that newsletter? Terrific, of course, Rudy. Yeah, and hi. Yes, you would have. And how many subscribers do we have in our audience?
Wow.
Great. And how many of you ever had sex with a goat? So, this is kind of, I'm not sure this will ever come again. And I think a number of people are alive who, and here, who are who embody a kind of living testimony to this uncanny moment. Folks folks, literary revivals like this don't occur, okay? I remember when Paul got the mailing list of people interested in receiving, this mimeographed zine about a totally out-of-print writer, and he got the mailing list number. It was up into the 800s, and we were like, I can't believe this many people care. The odds, the improbable nature of this revival in a literary prospect, in a literary reputation, I don't know what the comparison there could possibly be for it. I mean, people talk about how Henry James was all out of print at one point, and I don't know, I wasn't a witness to that, but I guess there were some people keeping the candle lit for Henry James. I don't know whether it was fewer than 800 people or more, but I'll say that the thing that we're all party to will not ever be remembered or understood on these terms. We're a kind of a living emblem of something ridiculous, something impossible, which is that he was not even really credible within the science fiction community, except as a kind of problem case. Oh yeah, he had that one good Hugo-winning book, and then, oh, that stuff was kind of difficult and funky, and yeah, he got written about in Rolling Stone one day, but it was nowhere. The whole thing was, and Paul, who I want to talk about just a little bit, Paul had a genius for listening and for what would I say, for recognition. When he began Crawdaddy magazine, he was writing about rock musicians in a way no one had done before. He was saying, this stuff is worth talking about. And the whole proposition changed the world, that this stuff was worth talking about on those terms. That it wasn't ephemeral, that it wasn't disposable, but that it was worth talking about. And he created a community. The people that all came and began writing for Crawdaddy at the beginning were true believers, and they also became the professionals, eventually, in a field that he almost willed into existence of serious rock writing or music writing about pop music. In a way, we're here as a sort of next stunt in his career. He said it's going to be a long climb. He didn't know how it was going to happen, but there are people who care the way I care, and they're out there, and we're going to start this newsletter, and Philip K. is going to, be understood, be recognized, be embraced. And so let's just do it. Let's begin licking envelopes. It's kind of an amazing thing. I speak of Paul in the past tense, which is a very bittersweet thing. He is alive. He's in very poor shape. I visited with him a few months ago, and it's very tricky, even understanding when you're with him what he does and doesn't understand in the conversation. He can't reply, and his physical, he looks prematurely aged. I mean, he's in his early 60s now, but he's sort of bent and unable to do very much for himself. But on the other hand, there are moments where something will supply a single word or just a response that makes you realize he's actually in there and hearing things. And I told him that, for instance, that the exegesis had been published, and I could tell it was mattered to him because I know him well enough. But he's not really able to care for himself, and he lives in a 24-hour.
He had a bicycle accident.
He fell off a bicycle, and that's. I'm sorry, I was skipping the simple description. Thank you, Graham. Yeah, he had a bicycle accident and hit his head, and for a while it seemed he was going to carry on as before. He was, he had a small part of his brain actually removed in a surgery because it was swelling right after the accident. But it seemed that he was going to recover from that, and then it turned out not. And his wife, Cindy Lee Burial, took care of him at home for a long time as he declined and then couldn't anymore. There's something called the Paul Williams Fund, and I'm going to give you an infomercial right now and say it's very low. For a while, people were going and contributing quite a lot. It really needs funds right now just for his basic care. And Cindy Lee is raising Paul's son as a solo mom, and she has no resources, and she's totally committed to taking care of Paul no matter what it takes, but that fund is her lifeline. So I really want you guys to go, and it's as simple as Googling Paul Williams Fund or adding a search term like, Crawdaddy or Philip K. Dick, and you'll get to that spot very easily. It will rise right to the top, okay? And you'll see that there's a PayPal donation button. So when we were part of that crack committee, those fools, I mean, Paul and John and those of us who were writing for that newsletter or licking the envelopes, we were a ramp check. The pig demon hit us, and we were believing in something that was improbable. Well, a ramp check is really huge now. I was trying to describe this feeling to someone today, and I said, this conference is the visible tip of an iceberg. Because, you know what? If this conference didn't happen, it would all be okay. There would be an enormous Philip K. Dick industry. Hollywood would go on making the movies. Scholars would go on studying the work. University professors would go on putting them on their syllabi. He's entrenched in the culture now. So we're right here are the marvelous, beautiful, self-congratulatory tip of a gigantic real iceberg. Well, when we were, touched by the pink beam in 1983, 84, and we were a ramp check, we were a tip with no tip with no iceberg. Everyone on the list was everyone who cared and who was committed to it, and yet somehow the iceberg was milled into existence, which is an incredible thing. So, it's its own form of both a utopian act and a transgressive act to believe in a possibility like that in a cynical, late capitalist environment. But it's also very Dickian, right? I think that's everything that I had in mind to say. I'm just really grateful to be here and to have heard everything I did this weekend. I feel like in a way, this is like a benediction. Not really what I'm saying, but what we've done here. It's a benediction on a cycle of activities that leads to us realizing that we are no longer even really steering the ship. It's just, a ramp check's work is sort of done. We conquered the world, and now he's an obnoxious, monolithic part of the culture that other people have to contend with, and dispute and debunk. Oh, he's not that great. Somebody else is good. Philip K. Dick has become unavoidable, which is an incredible